This is Filter Stories. I'm James Harper, and we've arrived in the middle of the fermentation episode from the Coffee Producer Toolkit podcast, made in collaboration with Lucia. If you haven't heard the previous episode, I highly recommend you listen to that first. To remind you, the goal here is to help coffee farmers have more profitable businesses, and I think this is going to be really valuable for you because hopefully it's already changing how you see the coffee industry, and this knowledge will help shape the rest of your coffee journey, and hopefully you change the industry for the better. To remind you, in the last episode, we looked at the basics of fermentation. What's actually happening in a fermentation tank? Now we get practical. So in this next section, we give advice on how a producer should use commercial microbes to do their fermentations. And here's the funny thing. A lot of roasters who are going to be hearing this next section, I think are going to be a little bit disappointed. Because in the specialty coffee world, interesting, unusual flavors are highly prized. There's been an obsession these last 15 years over very interestingly processed coffees, 120-hour fermentations on a black honey, anaerobic fermentations, whatever it is. Roasters have paid higher prices for these coffees, championed these coffees with their consumers, being like, look at these extraordinary flavors you're able to taste in a coffee. And when they hear fermentation advice from Lucia, somebody who is a microbial fermentation expert, they expect her to give recommendations that produce really amazing, unusual flavors. But that is not what we do here. What we do here is offer very practical, grounded advice on how producers can produce the same coffees consistently, reliably. Because here's the thing, the recipe for long-term success as a coffee farmer, it's not winning competitions, creating these very unusual lots of coffee that roasters buy maybe for a high price. No, that's all flash in the pan stuff. What actually pays the bills and keeps the farm running are good relationships with trusted coffee buyers, built over the long term, and all based on a producer creating a coffee that's dependably good. Something that a buyer can come back to year on year reliably. This is what the most successful coffee farms actually do. And Lucia and I think that this chasing of very exotic flavor varieties through really experimental fermentations, this has been a dangerous signal for many coffee farmers. Because what happens is that, coffee farmers, they see the prices that these experimental fermentation lots get, the excitement it generates, and naturally they all want in and they start doing it themselves. And look, this is a universal thing. It's even happened in podcasting. Podcasting from around 2016 got bigger and bigger. A lot of money came in. Some people got very successful, very wealthy. And then all of a sudden, every company decides it needs to have a podcast too. But then the whole thing faded as the commercial realities hit home. Look, podcasting, it's good in some specific circumstances, but it's not the money-making machine that everyone thought it would be. And it's the same thing in coffee farming. Producers see this handful of cases where some farmers have earned very high prices for these very experimental fermented coffees, and they think to themselves, maybe I should try this experimental fermentation thing myself. Maybe I can make good money too. But like I mentioned in the last episode, we have to bear in mind the historical context. The farmers who are able to run those experimental lots of coffee and earn good prices from them, we call them rockstar producers. And they can do it because they are, for the most part, historically wealthy. They were the privileged minority in history, where their predecessors owned most of the land. They can take this sort of experimental risk because they have fallback plans. There are other businesses in the wider family. A failed experiment on a lot of coffee is not going to sink their farm. Now, for everybody else, this is not the reality. Their farm is their livelihood. It's their one and only claim on land. It's not much land, but it's what they have. And it's very hard to make good money in coffee. In these last decades, coffee farming has been a brutal business to be in. Many are in debt. Lucia believes strongly that the last thing any producer should be doing is experimenting with risky fermentations. For example, long fermentations take a lot of time, and that creates bottlenecks in the mill. And there is only so much wet milling capacity. And so if coffee is sitting there for a long time fermenting, there are fresh cherries that need to get fermented now that are not. And they can get ruined sitting around. That hits the bottom line. Or maybe the entire fermentation just goes wrong. And, we're talking about a quarter container of the farmer's best coffee being ruined. And so what Lucia proposes in this next section is incredibly boring. Use commercial microbes to produce higher quality coffees consistently. We think that's the route to make more money. And so, All that out of the way, pressing play. Okay, Lucia, now we're going to cover 5 ways you can use commercial microbes to improve the profitability of your coffee farm. And I'm sure the first thought on many people's minds right now is all you have to do is add these microbes and you'll achieve phenomenal quality.
We often hear stories about famous producers who added specific yeast strains to their fermentations and sold their coffees for record prices. And the message here is usually, if you use the same microbes, you will also get the same results. But I'm sorry to say, James, you will not. Just adding microbes will not automatically give you award-winning coffee. And to prove this point, we spoke to Lester Lerner.
Hicimos una catación en la finca con los nuevos procesos de la nueva cosecha.
Lester is a third-generation Colombian coffee producer, and he actually came back to manage the family farm back in 2019. Now, up until that point, the family farm was very commodity-focused. He wanted to break into specialty, and so he planted many geisha trees. After a couple of years, they finally start producing. He gets the cherries, and now he's at the fermentation step. He thought this harvest was going to taste amazing, and he wanted to make it taste even better. So he added a commercial yeast. And to be clear, this was not the same yeast that you would use for making bread. Bread yeast and yeast made for coffee fermentations are completely separate yeasts. You can't use one for the other. We'll explain why later in the episode. So, Lester, he added yeast made specifically for coffee fermentations.
Y sacamos unos geishas que hicimos más o menos compré Saccharomyces cerevisiae.
And the coffee tasted terrible.
Lo mandé a catar y me dicen, sabe a papa. Yo casi me siento a llorar. A papa, herbal, no llegaba como...
It tasted like a herbal potato.
In my experience, you can't just add a single strain of yeast and expect incredible results. The fundamentals, your baseline, has to be there first.
That is exactly what Lester discovered. He realized with his new geisha trees, he didn't have his fundamentals in order. He mentioned he had phytosanitary problems on the farm.
Sí. Habíamos tenido, yo creo que problemas fitosanitarios, no nos había ayudado. El clima eran los primeros graneos.
But he did eventually get those bases covered and then did produce some of the best coffee he's ever tasted on his farm. Very balanced, 89 points.
No, pero es definitivamente el mejor café que me he probado en la finca. Era muy rico, perfil balanceado en todo. Nuestro catador le puso 89 puntos, pero yo espero que no sea porque haya sido mi cumpleaños.
A professional cupper graded at 89 points, but he hopes that wasn't just because it was his birthday and the cupper was being nice.
So the moral of the story is, have your coffees evaluated when it's your birthday. No, just kidding. Commercial microbes don't increase coffee quality that dramatically if you're not already doing a lot of other things well. Commercial microbes are not a quality shortcut for your microlots.
Microbes are not some magical dust that you can just sprinkle into a coffee fermentation to transform it into amazing flavors. Okay, so now let's explore the ways we do recommend you use microbes to improve your coffee processing. Lucia, you've identified 5 practical things that producers can do to improve their consistency and profitability right now with commercial microbes. And the first use case is consistency.
Use commercial microbes to improve the consistency of your fermentations the entire season.
And to show you what that looks like, we spoke to a producer who is using commercial microbes to improve his consistency.
I'm Fridolin. I started my career in coffee as an agronomist, working on different farms in different parts of the world.
Fridolin is an agronomist from Switzerland, and he's now based in northern Zambia, managing a large farm called Mount Sunzu. 800 hectares of land, 150 of which is coffee. Today, he's exporting 7-8 containers a year, and it's growing. So the stakes are very high for him, and he's very concerned about things going wrong.
These are very long-term investments. If you suddenly end up in a year getting much lower prices than expected, it can bring you in huge problems.
And one of those problems could be inconsistent coffee flavors.
In the past, working as an employee for other companies, I saw that having inconsistencies just leads to huge difficulty in sales.
And so his priority is consistency of flavors.
The target was, how do we produce good specialty coffee, which is very consistent season on season, so that we can establish long-term relationships.
And just like we covered earlier in the episode, Fridolin could see the risks of relying on wild yeasts during fermentations.
Wild yeast would be a potential hazard that we are inconsistent.
And so Fridolin, he uses commercial yeasts as a form of insurance. He can guarantee what the microbes are going to be in the fermentations every single time.
We try commercial yeast strains to see if we can produce good coffee with the assumption that that would be then more repeatable over years, as we could buy the same yeast strains again over and over.
So long story short, Fridolin uses commercial microbes as a form of insurance.
And that's the word, insurance. Use commercial microbes to get consistent coffee flavors batch to batch. That helps you offer the same coffee flavors to your buyers season after season.
All right, Lucia. Now, use case number 2 for commercial microbes.
Commercial microbes can help you do long fermentations safely.
But Lucia, please explain, what is the benefit of a longer fermentation?
Extended fermentations are appealing because if you have more time in the tank, you can add more complexity and more flavor development.
And just to prove this point, when I was in Copenhagen, after visiting Nova Nessus, I did a cupping with the team at La Cabra, a specialty coffee roastery. And they told me about a fermentation trial they'd done in collaboration with a Rwandan washing station called Shira. Basically, they tasted the same coffee, one of which was fermented like normal for 12 hours with whatever wild yeasts happened to get into the fermentation. And then the second, which was that same coffee, but the fermentation was extended all the way to 48 hours using Nova Nessus yeasts. And La Cabra's head roaster Evangelos explained how the coffee with a longer fermentation had more intense flavors.
The flavor intensity that the yeasty Shira had was much, much higher. Mm-hmm. And it was also a little bit cleaner. It had a little bit more acidity. I think maybe they are sharing the flavor notes. They have very, very similar notes.
Okay.
But everything that was going on in this cup, it was just a little bit higher in intensity.
And that increase in the coffee's complexity was positively reflected in a higher cup score. So can you explain why that works? Why does having more time in the tank lead to coffees having more complex flavors?
Well, it's because when the coffee is fermenting, it's unlike other foods like dairy, where you have microbes transforming the milk into cheese and then you eat that actual fermented product. With coffee, the fermentation is adjacent. So in coffee, we're not fermenting the coffee seed. We are fermenting the mucilage around the seed. And as that mucilage layer is decomposing, the microbes are creating flavors, they're creating acids, they're creating polysaccharides, which give us texture. And those molecules need to get into the seed for us to be able to perceive them.
I see. So the longer the coffee stays in the fermentation tub, the more time it has to soak up these flavors that are being produced in the slush all around it.
That's exactly right.
But if you don't control the microbial population during these very long fermentations, then you could get the wrong microbes proliferating and getting the wrong flavors into your coffee.
This is exactly the point. If that washing station had just tried a long fermentation, eventually a wild yeast would have contaminated the tank and introduced negative flavors or maybe even a defect. Because they used a Nova Nessus microbe, they were able to extend the number of hours of the fermentation to increase the intensity of the desired flavors without risking getting derailed by wild yeasts. Because when you introduce commercial microbes, they can crowd out the wild yeast. And because they can grow quickly, they can use up all of the available sugars before the wild microbes do. The commercial ones are not killing the wild yeast to eliminate them. It's just that the commercial strains are more abundant.
By using commercial microbes, you are stopping wild microbes coming in and ruining the fermentation halfway through. So that is the second way that using commercial microbes can increase your profitability. You are able to get those higher quality flavors through extended fermentations that are safe.
Okay, now we're going to look at the third way you can use commercial microbes to increase your profitability. And that is by increasing the quality of your imperfect coffee cherries. I recommend using commercial microbes to increase the quality of your lowest quality coffee cherries first.
Okay, say more. How does that work?
Most producers think that commercial microbes should only be used for their top cherries. In fact, many wait until the peak of harvest to even begin using them. But I recommend a different strategy. I recommend using commercial microbes to target those less than ideal coffee cherries. And the ones that I'm talking about, for example, are the cherries at the very beginning of harvest, which are more likely to be underripe and not have as much sugar, and the cherries towards the end of the harvest, which are more likely to be dry and overripe and more susceptible to defects. Those two will be of lower quality compared to the cherries that you pick in the middle of the harvest when everything is at its, peak ripeness. So these early and late cherries have more opportunity to improve and are really great candidates for commercial microbes.
And Helen Riley from the Novonesis team told us about some of the results she had seen with producers she had worked with.
So we have a case that's coming to mind where it was an 82 to an 85.
You were able to see a much bigger increase in the cup profile towards the lower end of the quality range compared to the top end. In Helen's example, commercial microbes helped an 82-point coffee improve 3 points to an 85. That's a much bigger jump than if you use those microbes for your best coffees. In fact, if you have an 89-point coffee, it's unlikely commercial microbes will help you get to a 92. In my experience, commercial microbes on an 89 or a 90-point coffee don't tend to increase in points at all. Now, there are still cases where you might want to use them on high-scoring coffees, but I don't believe it's the most effective use of your investment. By targeting your lower quality coffees first, you can be more profitable because there's more room to improve and usually larger volumes too. If that increase in quality can get you 50 cents or $1 more per pound, and that increase applies to about 40% of your entire harvest or more, that will have a much bigger impact than trying to find a buyer for a top-scoring micro lot, but maybe you only have a handful of bags of that.
And so by using commercial yeast on your less good cherries, you can noticeably increase their quality. And now you have more coffee at a higher score that sells for a higher price.
Okay, James, and now we're going to talk about use case number 4 for commercial microbes, which is freeing up processing capacity in your wet mill.
Yes, we heard many stories from producers where different parts of their wet mill became a bottleneck, where they weren't able to move coffees as fast as they would have liked through the wet mill, and so not all their coffees could reach the quality that they were hoping for. And the fermentation stage is one of those bottlenecks. Producers only have so many tanks to work with.
James, I have clients whose fermentations just take too long. And when a tank is occupied for 100 hours, that means they can't process more coffee. So they had this client who wanted to process more coffee. He had the patio space, but he didn't have the tank space because it was so cold in his area of the mountain. He got very little sunlight and the water was incredibly cold. So it would take, at least 100 hours for a lot of the mucilage to be off of the cherries. So what we can do is use these commercial microbes that are selected to have, really fast metabolism and that can break down that layer from the seed very quickly. And so he was able to dramatically reduce his fermentations from 100 hours to 24 hours and to turn over his tanks and process a lot more cherry.
Right, and the value of a commercial microbe here is that they have been selected and bred because they can perform very well at colder temperatures. The wild microbes just weren't able to do that.
Exactly. By using commercial microbes, his coffee moves through the wet mill much faster because his cherries aren't sitting in sacks fermenting uncontrollably and decomposing on their own, potentially picking up defects that could drag down his quality. And that alone is insurance for his quality and good for his bottom line. But it goes further than that. Because now his wet mill is faster. He can process coffee that he's bought from neighboring farms in his own wet mill, something that he couldn't do before because the fermentation step was a bottleneck. So this increases his revenue and profitability because he has more coffee to sell.
Okay, and now let's turn to the fifth and final way you can use commercial microbes to increase your profitability. Commercial microbes can help increase the storage life of your coffee.
So, James, even though I haven't seen any official research on this yet, even though I do think some should be forthcoming soon, it's my 12 years of experience that these types of fermentation can actually extend coffee's shelf life, that coffees that I ferment with certain microbes last longer. They stay fresher in green bean.
Explain how that works.
The original goal of fermentation for humans has been food preservation. So fermentation has always been tied to keeping food longer. If you had a fresh cabbage, you had to get rid of that cabbage and sell it very quickly because that cabbage was going to spoil. But if you could ferment it and create sauerkraut, you could keep that in your storage and feed your family for a whole year in that preserved state. So what fermentation does is lower the acidity so that you have less spoilage, and it creates a more stable product on the other side. Coffees that have undergone a controlled fermentation with selected microbes, I have found can last much, much longer than ones that are fermented with a wild or without control. So that's the first mechanism. But the second mechanism, I think, is intensity, because coffees that go through a longer fermentation tend to have more intense flavors, which means a greater concentration of flavor molecules to begin with. Think of the coffee like money sitting in a bank account, right? As coffee ages, due to reactions like oxidation, you get a slow, steady withdrawal of flavors. Every month in storage, the coffee is fading a little bit. And if you started with $100 and are constantly withdrawing funds, you can go broke really fast. The coffee is faded within a couple of months. But if you have loaded up that account with 10,000's worth of flavor compounds, you can withdraw for several months and still feel rich a year later. One of the ways controlled fermentations help coffee last longer is that you have more flavor molecules to work with. You are depositing more in the bank account.
All right, and now to bring this back to profitability. A longer shelf life for your coffee can improve your profitability. If your coffee lasts longer, you have more time to find the right buyer at a good price. It can sit in the warehouse without losing value. You want to avoid being forced to sell under pressure for a low price because the clock is running out on your coffee's freshness.
And also, this allows a customer to buy more coffee from you at once because they know that your coffee is going to last longer and not go stale in their warehouse.
It also, by the way, opens up more distant markets. Maybe a buyer who has a very, very long shipping time. You can now ship your coffee further. And so that also opens up the pool of available buyers for you.
These are the 5 use cases for using commercial microbes, but this is by no means an exhaustive list because we don't have time to go through all of the possible benefits.
But the ones we've covered today are: you get more consistency, batch to batch.
You could extend your fermentation safely to guarantee good flavors.
It can bring up the scores of your lower quality coffee so you can get better prices.
And you can free up your processing capacity in your wet mill, avoiding spoilage and increasing your revenue.
And finally, it can also help extend the shelf life of your coffee, so you can sell more coffee to the same buyer or to more distant markets. But to get these benefits, it really matters how you use commercial microbes, how you control your fermentations. As Lester Lerner said to us,
No era la primera vez que utilizamos levadura, pero creo que era la primera vez que utilizamos la levadura bien.
And so, coming up next, how to run a good fermentation. Pressing pause. In this next section, we go through the basics of what a good fermentation protocol looks like. And it's fairly self-explanatory, so there isn't much for me to add. Except for one thing. Coffee farms are a very difficult place to do controlled fermentations. Let me give you the contrast. In the wine world, fermentations happen inside fermentation cylinders that are closed off to the environment. The environment in which they sit is a closed off room that is very carefully controlled. Winemakers are petrified of the wrong yeast or bacteria getting in and changing the fermentation. That's why they scrub their facilities to death. They sanitize their instruments over and over. They sometimes even put sulfur dioxide on the grapes to lower the wild microbial population. All of this is done so that when they add their microbes, maybe it's like a Saccharomyces strain, that is the one that's going to proliferate and nothing else. Now, in the coffee world, wet mills couldn't be more different from wine facilities. Instead of being in these hermetically sealed rooms, a coffee wet mill is out in the open. You have people coming in from the fields with microbes and bacteria on their hands, on their boots, on their clothes. You have microbes floating in the air. The fermentation tanks are just these big vats that are just open to anything coming in. There are countless opportunities for the wrong kind of microbe to come along and ruin a fermentation. So that's the context for why Lucia recommends what she does. Cleaning the facilities very carefully, cleaning the tools. And as you'll hear later on, we have examples of producers using sealed blue barrels, which are also good because by sealing the barrels, where the fermentation takes place inside those barrels, you are not letting bacteria that's floating in the air come inside. And now, pressing play. Okay, so now We're looking at the practical ways to run a fermentation so you can get the result you want every time. And achieving a successful fermentation is so much more than just using the right microbes.
You don't only need good microbes, yes. And the first thing I'd say is that while commercial microbes are a powerful tool, they're not a substitute for a good process. And a controlled culture will help you, but it won't compensate for dirty equipment or poor monitoring or not taking any records. So at a minimum, you need 3 things. The first is a clean environment, and that means anything that the microbes will come in contact with. So that's the tanks or barrels, any tools that you have for mixing, and then also your water. One of the things to keep in mind is that these organisms are alive, and if you have chlorinated water, then the chlorine will act as an antimicrobial. So if you're getting your water from a city source and trying to do yeast, that's something that could antagonize them. So make sure you don't have chlorinated water. And another important thing is close monitoring. So I really recommend having a pH meter and a thermometer because they're your eyes inside of the fermentation. So you are going to want to take data. The last thing is cupping. You have to taste the coffees as you go because we need to build that connection between what's happening in the tank and what flavors you're tasting in the cup. So without that feedback loop, you really can't improve.
Now, when it comes to collecting data, are we talking notebooks, spreadsheets?
For me, a notebook is enough. The discipline is what matters. Taking good notes, using your phone for videos and pictures, that's a really underutilized tool because the video and the pictures will automatically give you date and time and more context, like what was the weather around that date. Things that I would love for you to take notes on are not just what is the pH and what is the temperature, but other things like how was the weather during that time? What did the tank smell like? What was the condition or the quality of the cherry before you started your fermentation? Kind of keep a diary, write everything down, and then once you taste your coffee, you'll go back to your notes and see if you can make any connections.
Now, what we'd like to show you here is what a fermentation protocol looks like for smaller producers. And our partner sponsor for the series, the Coffee Quest, they've been trialing this barrel-based method with many of the producers they work with. Now, to be clear, the Coffee Quest understands that these smaller producers, they can't absorb big losses, right? A failed fermentation can be economically devastating for a smaller producer. So what they do first is experiment in very small batches. They work very closely with the professional cuppers at the Coffee Quest buying stations. And then only once they develop these repeatable protocols that deliver consistent, high quality flavors, do they then scale up. So let's now hear from Victor Chala, a producer in Huila, who worked with the Coffee Quest to hear what kind of fermentation protocols they developed together.
En este momento se le están aplicando levaduras prácticamente a todos los lotes porque no son de café especiales, ¿sí?
Victor only uses commercial yeasts on his conventional coffees, doesn't put it on his exotic varieties because they've already reached a very high quality. Instead, he uses commercial microbes on his lower quality coffees to noticeably improve their flavor profile.
Cafés que dan 86, 87, 88, entonces no necesitan la levadura.
For his fermentations, Victor uses these large plastic blue tubs with lids. In Colombia, they call them canecas. Okay, so here's his protocol. For every 500 kilos of depulped coffee, Victor heats 14 liters of water to about 30 degrees Celsius. Then he mixes in 500 grams of dry commercial yeast and he lets it activate for about 10 minutes. And again, to be clear, this is not baker's yeast. This is yeast for coffee fermentations. Very different.
Para activar los microorganismos que tiene la levadura y luego ya vamos y las llevamos a las canecas.
Then he turns to his barrels. He has about 14 big blue barrels all lined up, and into each one he puts 45 kilos of demucilated coffee, plus 1 liter of the activated yeast solution.
Y ahí mismo le agregamos azúcar.
And he also adds sugar depending on the Brix readings of the cherries. So if the cherries have a very high sugar content, they're very mature, 17 on the Brix meter, he only adds maybe half a kilo of sugar per barrel. If it's towards the lower end, 12 on the Brix meter, he adds a kilo of sugar to each barrel. This added sugar provides lots of starting energy for the fermentation to get going quickly.
Y mañana por la mañanita la destapo, revuelco y vuelvo y la sello.
Then Victor seals each barrel, turning it into an anaerobic fermentation. And every morning he opens it again, gives it a stir and seals it back up. At the 50-hour mark, he adds molasses.
Y ya cuando van 50 horas de fermentación, aplico la miel, la melaza.
This was suggested to him by the Coffee Quest because they found that adding molasses at this step made the coffee cleaner. And then 24 hours after that, so roughly 70 hours of total fermentation time, the coffees come out of the barrels and into his secadora, his drying tunnel. A few things worth noting. First,
Se le puede echar un poquito de agua porque muchas veces queda muy seco.
no extra water is added to this process, which keeps his water use remarkably low. For some dry varieties, Victor might add a splash of water to keep things moving, but that's it. Second, Victor mentioned that these blue barrels have a huge advantage over the more common large concrete tank that many producers use for their fermentations.
La diferencia es muy grande. Él se quema, él completamente se pone caliente.
The blue barrels don't overheat because in a large fermentation tank, all that microbial activity can drive temperatures dangerously up, and that can ruin a coffee's flavor. But in smaller barrels, there just isn't enough mass for that runaway heating to happen. The temperature stays more stable, and the fermentation stays in control. So Lucia, what do you make of that approach?
One of my philosophies is if it's not broke, don't fix it. So if this is working for Victor, then that's great. One thing I would like to caution our audience against is blindly copying somebody's recipe. This reminds me of what we talked about in episode 1 with Lalo about, your soil and your conditions are very unique. So if you start applying nitrogen without first taking a soil sample, you really could be wasting a lot of money. And the other thing I wanted to mention was about how Victor rehydrates his yeast, and these steps are really specific to the yeast that he buys. So not all commercial microbes require all of the steps that Victor walked us through. This is one of the reasons I really love working with the Pichia yeast sold by Novonesis. It's because they're able to be applied very easily. You basically just open the bag and apply them directly to coffee cherries or to pulped coffee. There's no need to rehydrate them with warm water. There's no time to, wait for them to wake up. You don't need to add sugar or molasses. And the elimination of these steps can save a lot of time. So I would spend maybe an hour to an hour and a half preparing the microbes for my larger fermentations. And when I use the Novonesis microbes, it's 30 seconds.
Now, turning back to those blue barrels that Victor is using, would you recommend that a larger producer also uses those blue barrels? Because I can imagine having lots of these barrels, at some point, once you get beyond 50 barrels, that's a lot to manage.
This is not a hard and fast rule. If you're getting less than 2,000 pounds of cherry per day, then I think the barrels make a lot of sense. But if you have more than 2,000 pounds of cherry in a day, then I think putting all of that coffee in a single tank or larger tanks is going to make your process easier.
And what are good rules to follow when it comes to cleaning?
For any size fermentation, from a 5-gallon bucket trial to a plastic barrel to a 10-ton tank, you are going to want to prioritize cleaning after every fermentation, after every use. Cleaning after every use is going to give your commercial microbes the best chance to succeed. I also recommend you use a detergent, especially later in the harvest when the dirt and mucilage accumulates, but please avoid any scented soaps. At this stage, the coffee is very vulnerable and it can easily pick up those aromas. The regular hoses I usually find in coffee wet mills don't do enough for stubborn coffee mucilage and dirt. So a great investment is a pressure washer for your equipment and your tanks. It's also a good idea to have something you can use to sanitize your tools and equipment. Something really simple like a spray bottle with 60 to 70% alcohol or 5% white vinegar.
And finally, when it comes to recording data, how often should you be taking readings?
How often to take a reading really depends on your personal preference. For example, you could be somebody like Manuel Mata, who has sensors hooked into all parts of the process, and he's getting data every 20 seconds.
Yeah, listen to the previous episode on post-harvest processing to learn more about Manuel Mata's approach.
For me, I'm a little bit more old school. I like the analog thermometer and the, analog pH meter, and I take data 3 times a day. In the morning, middle of the day, and the end of the day. So it depends on your comfort level, but at the very least, I would recommend at least twice a day to check on your temperature and your pH measurements of your fermentation. Those 2 data points every day will give you an idea of how the fermentation is getting along.
So those are our practical tips for how to run a fermentation. But of course, what works at somebody else's farm will probably not work on your farm, so you have to do a lot of trial and error. In the show notes, we have a lot of practical resources to help you master fermentations on your farm.
Okay, now coming up next, we'll cover what it costs to use commercial microbes.
Pressing pause. Okay, so that's it for this episode. Coming up in the next episode, we finish this 3-parter on fermentation, and we look at the economics of using commercial microbes and some of the really gnarly questions that producers have to face. In a way, we're going to explore the question, who gets to determine what a high-quality coffee is? I'll see you in the next episode.